Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. Well, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to the organizers of this conference. It's very timely for taking a big view of the bioeconomy. And I would like to try to contribute to an overall view of the bioeconomy with some work that we have just completed. This is jointly with a couple of graduate students at Colorado State University, and much of the work was completed this last year while I was on sabbatical at Chalmers in Sweden. But what I'm going to present here is an overview of the industry through the lens of patent data from 1970 to 2013. And just a pre-note, I did not anticipate this at all when first invited to give this talk by a gal back in June, but very quickly it was accepted and published and came out just last month in Nature Biotechnology. So if you want to reference any of the data that I'm sharing with you this morning, it's already in press. Now, of course, most of the folks in this room know, in a sense, the backstory on biofuels, but I want to give you a little bit of my overarching narrative first so that we can put this all in context. Of course, the earliest internal combustion engines used biofuels, but they really fell completely out of vogue for much of the 20th century. I'm compiling here a number of separate data series from the Energy Information Agency. In the top panel, well, these are just Brent spot price of oil, but I've also overlaid on it several events, policy events. Well, 9/11 was not really a policy, but it was an event, all right. And then we have California's ban of MTBE coming in 2003, the European Union's emissions trading system, and the U.S. Renewable Fuel Standard. In the second panel, we have the world output of petroleum motor fuels in the black line on top, and world output of biofuels in the green line on bottom. The gray line in the middle, reading the right-hand axis, is the percent share. The bottom panel is world output of fuel ethanol to give us a view of these trends over time. So biofuels, as you can see from that bottom panel, it only begins at 1980, but were really rediscovered after the oil crises of the 1970s. The early history of it there, for about 2 decades, Brazil led in the production. Then came 9/11, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as you see in the top panel, the steady growth in oil prices. And this, I would argue, led to a convergence in the political economy, in the energy sector. You saw national security interests, environmental interests, and agricultural interests start to march together. And this is what led to these large policy shifts at around that time, of which I've already spoken and highlighted up there. But another outcome of this was large investments started to emerge in R&D, both public investments and private sector investments, exploring many different biofuel production pathways. And I know many folks in this room have been involved in the EBI, which was private sector money, but DOE and USDA funding have been huge. In trying to look into systematically the question of who is innovating in biofuels, I found that it was very difficult to stitch together, say, R&D spending data series. So instead, I've chosen to dig into the patent literature and the patent data to help us get an overview. First, I want to define what we are looking at in terms of the industry, and we do so with this schematic here. This was the result of about 5 years of iterations with the patent data, seeing what was actually being done in the industry. And in the end, we boiled it down to essentially, on the left-hand side, a variety of resources generating feedstocks, which then channel through a series of different competing processes, sometimes complementary processes, and resulting in an entire range of potential biofuel molecules on the right-hand side. But there are a few things that are excluded from this. I want to point out two in particular. One is hydrogen in most cases. We're not going into the hydrogen economy full bore, although there may be some biohydrogen on the fringes of this, but it's very, very minor. The other thing that we are excluding, as alluded to in Bruce's excellent talk just prior to this, there's the entire question of cogeneration for electricity, which would be fixed station use of biofuels, largely solid biofuels. We're also excluding that. We're really talking about liquid means of storing energy in chemical bonds that can be used to essentially drive transportation. These are the kinds of molecules that potentially we're looking at, ranging.
There's an error in the one, just 2/3 of the way down.
I'll be on that, sir. Thank you. So the questions for our study. We've got words for guys like you in Colorado. So given these changing market conditions, the changing policy environment, the investments going on, both public and private, how has the rate of invention in biofuels and biorefining changed over time? Who has contributed most? Is it the U.S.? We might be forgiven for thinking that this is a U.S.-dominated technology. Is it? Or is it? What's Europe or Asia's role? What about the BRICS? We just heard about Brazil. What is the relative rate of advance of the competing technologies within that those pathways I just showed you? Don't worry, we'll go back and dig into them in a little more detail. What about ethanol versus biodiesel? Conventional versus advanced under RFS definitions. What about biological versus the thermochemical pathways like syngas or pyrolysis? To what degrees have different types of R&D organizations been responsible for driving invention? Has it been largely government and the public sector, universities, or has it been largely industry? Has this varied across different countries and regions? And I'd like to try, maybe somewhat ambitiously then, given the data that we dig into, to draw some future implications. So what can patents tell us? One of the very nice things about patent data is that it is one of the most standard things we can observe across different countries. Let me just help develop a little bit your intuition before we plunge in by describing the nature of the data. Patent families are the unit of analysis that we're converging on using in this kind of work. And for an example, here is a Swedish biofuel invention. This was the original registration at the Swedish Patent Office. That was quickly followed by a World Intellectual Property Office PCT filing on the same invention. Then they went to Canada and made a filing there, and then the USPTO, and then finally, since these guys are smart and they know which way the world and the wind is blowing, they went and got this document to protect themselves as well. Now here you've got 5 different observations, but it's really one thing. So we need to manage that in the nature of our data set. So the methods, we first designed and ran queries in Thomson Innovation, a large patent vendor. It was very complex, and this is where the grad students came in very handy because they're doing their PhDs in molecular biology. David, this is how I solved the problem of not being a biologist exactly. They designed and ran this complex set of queries. They also used company names. They knew about Poyet, they knew about Gevo, and so they seeded queries with the pure play biotech companies. They identified all of the related patent family filings in all patent offices worldwide, downloaded that entire set, and then set about cleaning and structuring the resulting data. You need to review these things. This is semi-done by hand, and it's a simultaneous process of categorizing by technology, is it ethanol, is it biodiesel, is it algae, or deciding that a particular technology is really outside the pale and you drop it from the data set. We then re-aggregate the data around the invention itself. So we collapse the 5 patent documents into a single patent family and count it instead of the 5. And then we can analyze in a number of different ways that help us start to dig into these questions. So, first results, the global landscape. For some data summary, we found about 66,000 documents worldwide over this time period. These were issued by 81 patent offices. They covered about 22,000 inventions, which meant an average of about 3 documents per patent family, per invention. And the inventors resided in precisely 100 countries. Not sure exactly why it came out that round. This is the time series. With truncation correction, and I'll detail the methods for that because it was not straightforward. Now I want to highlight, really, I see in this curve, and this is a very important curve, it's not quite the elephant curve of late, which has gotten a lot of press, but I think this one still has some very important implications for the future of the bioeconomy. The first era was leading up to the Iranian Revolution and the first real oil crisis. Almost nothing. A little bit of ethanol work, probably coming in from the industrial side, even the beverage side. Then, shocked by the Iranian oil crisis, things picked up in certain jurisdictions. And you had a steady period from about 1979 until the mid-1990s, but it was a very flat era. Mostly ethanol work, biogas work, but we'll dig into that. And then something happened in the mid-1990s, and you went into this linear growth up until about 2003, 2004, right in the post-9/11 world, and we went into exponential growth there for these 4 years until 2008. And then the takeoff started to wobble, or the airliner started to level out. Maybe we came into a more mature period in the industry, but for whatever reason, there seems to be a leveling off there. Naturally, some of this depends upon our estimations and corrections there for the truncation. But this can be a bit misleading to look just at aggregate global data. So instead, we seek to break it down by where these inventions are coming from. Oh, first though, I want to scrutinize that period right there, the 2004 to 2008 rapid takeoff, and point out against, normalizing against worldwide all patent families, the same time period, I think it was about a 3% growth rate in all inventions worldwide, while in biofuels, we are looking at something more in the 20 to 30% growth rate, even though they're so steep then that averaging over that isn't really meaningful. But it was definitely a departure from business as usual. In order to break out by where things are happening, the most easy and systematic way it turned out to do this was to look at the patent office in which the first filing for that invention was made. And in fact, the story began in Japan. That linear growth starting in the mid-1990s was almost all driven by Japan. Japan started earlier and Japan peaked earlier, and Japan went into decline around 2002. Somewhat it follows the story of the Japanese economy. 99% of these inventions first filed in Japan, by the way, are by Japanese inventors. Europe has a very different shape. Europe was there since the Iranian oil crisis, providing those subsidies that were giving us the ethanol inventions steadily throughout the 1980s. But Europe really didn't come to the game until the post-9/11 world. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, English-speaking jurisdictions that are a very favorable place for filings, have a significant contribution here. They're on about the same time schedule as Europe as well. But again, just like Japan, Europe and the other English-speaking OECD countries here are in decline since about 2008. The United States, I'm sorry, but we're not the center of the universe in the US when it comes to biofuel invention. We're in the game, but as you can see, these y-axes are all normalized, standardized. It's about the same contribution as Japan or Europe or these other jurisdictions. The US is holding a little bit more steadily, but we've still hit some sort of glass ceiling there, so it would seem. Now some of the interesting stories. Where did Korea come from? But almost out of nowhere, Korea has become a serious player in introducing inventions. But the real story is the next panel, my friends. China, just like Korea, coming almost out of nowhere. Now, so much influence by China on these global statistics that we have to look at China a little bit more carefully here. China has been a developing country. They've not had a patent system. Can we really believe these data? So we dug into the Chinese data. And the first thing I want you to see, this is our global trends here. The red section of the data are Chinese patent applications that have not issued yet. So single document patent families that only exist in China. If we remove them from the global data, the world has definitely gone into a downward trend in inventions in the area of biofuels since 2007. If we look inside the Chinese data, by size of patent family, we see that huge population, that huge subset of just applications. We can see that a lot of them, however, are granting. Those are the light gray. And some of them are moving into 3 or more documents per patent family, meaning that there have been follow-on filings or foreign filings. So what about the Middle Kingdom looking beyond its own shores? Well, inventors in China are only making small contributions. In the bottom panel here, the dark blue, very small lines at the bottom of the graph are the inventions made in China that are being filed overseas, outside of China. If we take these data and aggregate across country of inventor, here's who's contributing. It's pretty much 1/5, 1/5, 1/5, 1/5 China, Europe, Japan, United States, and then the rest of the world. Now, if we look at our analysis of technologies and we break down by major pathways, these are the 6 major pathways that we find. Traditional ethanol coming from sugars and starches that come from crops. Biodiesel that come from oil seeds. Biogas that comes from anaerobic digestion of undifferentiated biomass. Number 4, the cellulosic ethanol through biological fermentation means. Or number 5, a pyrolysis or syngas or thermochemical conversion of biomass to a variety of molecules. And then finally, basically photosynthetic autotrophs or algae. If we look at the global invention data across these 6 major technical pathways, what we find is ethanol, traditional ethanol, is running away as the one pathway in which the most inventions continue to be made. Biodiesel is second. Biodiesel took a huge dip around 2007, 2008. We speculate about how that may have had something to do with the biodiesel blend policy in the US, dropping off and then getting reinstated. We're not sure. Biogas is the third one that is still growing. Notice the other 3, cellulosic ethanol, thermochemical, and algae, have all gone into a nosedive as of about 2009, 2010. Do you see the characteristic in the split here? The 3 that continue to climb are the 3 that have made it into being essentially commercialized biofuel standards, biofuels pathways. All 3 of these have biorefineries implemented and they are working. The other 3 are still in very much the pilot phase. They're your advanced biofuels, but interest has dropped. Now we can take this and also break it out by where the work is being done. We can see in the upper left panel, the United States has relatively emphasized innovation in biodiesel. But U.S. work in cellulosic ethanol has a bit of an uptick in 2012, our last year. Algae rose and fell. Europe, similar pattern. If you look at Japan, the lower left, that early work in the 1990s was largely in thermochemical pathways. A little bit of biogas and a little bit of ethanol. But these were the big engineering firms like Mitsubishi working on syngas and pyrolysis. And China, in the right-hand panel, is the one that has driven really the further innovation in ethanol, biodiesel, and biogas. Now, China is also looking at and still increasing in the 3 advanced biofuel categories, but not as rapidly. So much of the story is told by China. I'm going to quickly go through and summarize our analysis of who is doing the innovating in interest of time here. Roughly, our division will be between public sector organizations and industry. These can indicate a number of things about who is financing the R&D, who's conducting the R&D, and perhaps the relative influence of what we would call push versus pull policies incentivizing the innovation. Globally, here's how it shakes out. Industry has accounted for 56% of the inventions by themselves. In collaboration, public and private sectors working together have contributed about 5% of the inventions, but public sector governments, academics, nonprofits have contributed an additional 20% of the inventions by themselves. So this speaks to the so-called educational industrial complex and the need for technology transfer from public sector into private sector in order to advance this. We get some very interesting differences, however, if we run the analysis at the levels of individual jurisdictions. In the US and Europe, we see a pattern where industry really dominated at about 2/3, and the public sector really about 10%. In Japan, industry is much more at the driving seat with 3/4. But then, if we look into the China phenomenon, it flips completely the other direction. Almost 40% driven by public sector. And mind you, in our 35% of industry in China, this includes the state-owned enterprises. So the role of the public sector in China has been massive. I also point out that in the timeline over there, the light blue line is the public sector. Patenting by public sector entities took off first and fastest, and it took all the way until 2010 for industry to catch up and exceed. In the paper, we are able to list out our top assignee organizations. I want to point out that DuPont Pioneer is #1 in our weighted scheme. Chinese Academy of Sciences is #2. We do see University of California in the top 20, largely as a result of the BP collaboration there, but we see an awful lot of Chinese universities coming very close to that in the next 20, leading in the top 40 list. So to conclude, the rate of invention in biofuel technologies over time grew rapidly and then in most jurisdictions flattened out or went into decline, except for China. Which countries? Very evenly spread around the world. Which technologies are being advanced? Those that have gone commercial continue to be innovated in. These are probably incremental cost-saving innovations that are now happening, but the big bet stuff in the advanced biofuels seem to be tapering off. Which types of R&D organizations are responsible? Public sector does have a very crucial driving role, but industry is very much at the table, but this is differing by country. And as far as the future of biofuels innovation, we're out of time, so we're going to have to talk about that later. Thank you very much.